Welcome to Leadership Where It Matters Most. The family is the most important institution in the world. The future of the church passes through the family. The church has the greatest mission of any organization ever. Go and make disciples of all nations. The family and the church. This is where leadership matters most.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to Leadership Where It Matters Most. Today's episode has Professor Michael Breidenbach as my guest. Dr. Michael Breidenbach is an associate professor of history at Ave Maria University. He's a senior affiliate for legal humanities at the Program for Research on Religion and Urban Civil Society at the University of Pennsylvania. He's the author of Our Dear Bought Liberty, Catholics and Religious Toleration in Early America, which was published in 2021. Dr. Breidenbach was a fellow of the Royal Historical Society in 2022. He's held research positions at Princeton University, St. John's College, Oxford, Corpus Christi College, and a number of other institutions that I'm looking at right now, some of which I don't even think I can pronounce very well. So Dr. Breidenbach is just a real gift in the sphere of education. He's got a long runway ahead of him, which I'm very excited about. He and his wife, Dr. Janice Chi Breidenbach, who was a previous episode guest on this show, live in Southwest Florida. So today, Dr. Michael and I speak a little bit about kind of his testimony, where he came from, how he ended up where he is. We talk about the democratic process in federal elections for the United States. Keep in mind, the episode was recorded on November 18th, so just a few weeks after President Donald Trump was reelected. And this will probably air, I'm imagining, after the Inauguration Day. So just to put the timestamp on this. We talk a little bit about the process that we watched and observed here in Canada, Kamala Harris, and how she was put as the Democratic nominee. We talk a little bit about the electoral process and some of the history of different realities in federal politics in the states that have come to be. For example, they didn't always have a ticket featuring a presidential nominee and the VP pick. That was something introduced later. And then we talked a lot about sort of Catholics in the public space and public life and its history in the United States, how we've evolved to having now a couple of Catholics that have actually been elected as president for that country, and some of the persecution that early Catholics endured, and a lot of different other things. So quite a meandering conversation. I could have went on. And Dr. Michael and I, after we stopped recording, chatted for another 15 or 20 minutes or so. And there's a lot there. So I'm sure I'll have Dr. Michael on again. So without further ado, enjoy this episode. Dr. Michael Breidenbach, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much, Brett.
So why don't you kick us off? Because some people might know of you, some people may not. So why don't you just tell us who you are and how you became Dr. Michael Breidenbach, and what a little bit of your story for us today.
Sure. So I'm an associate professor of history at Ave Maria University, where my wife and I have been for 11 years now. And we have one son, and we live in town. And we've really been blessed to call this place home for over a decade, have a lot of great colleagues and friends. And we didn't think of moving to Florida when we first got married. We were married in Cambridge, England. I was doing my graduate work in Cambridge. We met at an academic conference, surprise, for two professors who became married. Mm-hmm. And we met in Cambridge and got married there. I spent a year in Princeton, where I had a postdoctoral fellowship and was a lecturer in history and politics there for a year. And then we both received job offers at Ave Maria University and went down to Florida with a hand-me-down GMC Vandura van. These were really all the rage in the 90s. They had a VHS, little mini TV in the back. We inherited it from my wife's family. Took that car down without air conditioning in the middle of the summer to Florida. And so that was our inauguration to the Florida climes. And it was great for a newlywed couple, really. Just kind of going there, trucking it by ourselves, and finding a new world for us to explore, and hopefully to do a lot of good for our students who are all sort of coming here, most of whom are Catholic, but really want to grow in their faith and learn in the liberal arts tradition. So it's been a great privilege to work here. I'm originally from the Midwest of the United States and was born and raised there and went to Northwestern University, so just a state below in Illinois, for 4 years before I went for my graduate work in England.
That's great. Thank you for sharing. So you're the third professor now from Ave Maria that's been on the podcast. So I wonder, I didn't prep you with this question, but maybe you could just tell us a little bit about Ave Maria, because it's a pretty unique environment.
It is, yeah. It started over 20 years ago now, so it's relatively new in terms of higher education. Some colleges, as you know, in the United States go back to early America. But we're relatively new. Although we're Catholic, we're not associated with a religious order as most colleges are in the United States, like the Jesuits. And so we have a unique, charism is maybe not the right word in terms of universities, but certainly a unique mission in terms of very much a lay-focused, sort of in the middle of the world kind of mission. And it was founded by the founder of Domino's Pizza, Tom Monahan, who was a billionaire, because he donated almost all of his money to ventures like this one. And so it originally started in Michigan, and then Mr. Monahan had the opportunity to create a permanent campus as well as a town surrounding the university called Ave Maria. And that was originally just tomato fields. And he converted that with some local developers into a burgeoning town, the largest growing Southwest Florida development, and one of the largest growing communities in the United States. So we're sort of 35 minutes away from Naples, which is an international destination, especially for vacation. So we're kind of in a unique place. Florida is a growing state, as you know, has a lot of things going for it, including hurricanes. But we've been blessed so far not to have any of them make serious damage where we are. And the university itself is in incredible position now to take advantage of the flourishing classical liberal arts education that we see in the West. Online charter schools, which are sort of public schools, but have their own sort of charter to use a curriculum that's different from regular state-sponsored schools. A lot of Catholic families that have created kind of dynasties at our university, right? Oh, another one. I've had 5-year siblings already. So we're very well positioned to sort of educate those who already are sort of interested and well disposed to a classical liberal arts education, but also have in mind a vocation either to marriage or to the celibate life, and also have in mind a profession. So we have over 30 majors, many of which are pre-professional or sort of more obviously oriented towards a certain kind of profession like nursing or business, and all the other traditional liberal arts majors like history, which is the department that I'm in. So it's a flourishing university. We have over 1,300 students now, several graduate programs in theology, business, education, and more to come.
That's great. I was going to ask because I wasn't as familiar with the graduate programs, but that's great because you didn't launch with the graduate programs. Is that correct?
The university, as a university, launched with a PhD and master's in theology straight away. When it was a college in Michigan, I don't believe it had a theology PhD program. I could be wrong about that. From the time that I've been here, there's always been a theology graduate program, which is really essential to the mission. They've gone on to teach at other universities and seminaries to continue an authentically Catholic education for others.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for that. And of course, my personal connection to Ave Maria was Josh and Lisa Canning, who I think you know.
Oh, yes.
They're good Canadians that were down there for a time. They're back up in Canada now. Yeah. So shout out to them.
Yes.
So, Michael, we've just come through. A lot of the audience to this podcast is Canadian, some in other parts of the country, some Americans, but not as many as listening up here in Canada. So us Canadians just observed the federal election down in the United States. And it was a sight to behold for a number of months, which was interesting. And I have lots of questions. I guess the first one, just to get clarity, is the United States a democracy or a republic or some strange combination of the two? And what's the difference? Help us understand that.
The answer is yes.
I thought you'd say that.
It has democratic elements, to be sure. It's formally a republic, but it certainly has a lot of democratic elements to it. And it depends how you want to define democracy. But I think, and certainly in several definitions of that term, we would also consider it to be a democracy. And so let me just step back and explain what I think is sort of uncontroversial, which is that the United States is a republic, which is to say that the sovereignty rests in the people themselves. The monarchic model, something that, at least in a titular way, still exists in several countries, including the United Kingdom, is a monarchy, right? And so the way that the ancients distinguish between these two designations is that a republic is a res publica, a public thing, and a monarchy is sort of like a res privata, right? A private thing. So what does that mean? It means that in a monarchy, the monarch, as it were, owns, right, the nation or the country, if you will. These terms sort of have different meanings throughout history, but effectively, the one who owns the land, right, is the monarch. And then the monarch may offer to lease the land to others or to gift the land to others. That's sort of the idea. Whereas a republic is one in which the people are ultimately, as it were, the owners, right, of the country. For several reasons, sometimes practical and other times theoretical, they believe that the best thing to do is to elect representatives or have sort of appointees to help to run the country. So ultimately, the sovereignty rests in the people. That's we, the people of the United States, right, as the Constitution of the United States begins, but then elect representatives to actually govern on a day-to-day basis. But in critical situations, the people then can decide whether it's a referendum at a state level or something like that. So that brings me to a democracy, right? The first democracy was Athens, and that's where everyone who was eligible as a citizen to vote could vote and should vote, right? And so that was on all the major questions of politics. We don't do that in the United States. Very few countries do that. There are some organizations who do that. But so we're not an Athenian democracy, but I think when people talk about democracy today, I think they're talking especially about whether the people have a say directly in politics. And the federal structure of the United States is such that at some points in one's civic life, one will directly vote on something. So for instance, in Florida, as a Florida citizen, I recently voted on several referenda, which includes boring things like taxation and whether fishing is a public right, but also very hot button issues on abortion and marijuana usage. So these are issues where the state of Florida asked the Florida citizens to vote whether those things should be allowed or not. And that was something that was given to the people to vote directly for. So it's a republic ultimately with democratic elements, but critically, it also has a federal structure. So not everything is just in a national government. There's also local and state levels of a government as well.
Right. Very good. Thank you. So we're recording this on November 18th. And so shortly after the federal election in the States, and probably airing this after the inauguration in January. But just to give that timestamp, I wanted to ask Michael, because we heard up in Canada the vote that was related to abortion in Florida. What exactly were you voting for? What was that all about?
So it was called Amendment 4. And in Florida, you can petition to have an amendment. It has to go through several hoops to go through, but eventually you can have an amendment proposed for the electorate. And this particular amendment was in the context of the Florida legislature and governor, which is Republican, decided that abortion would be permissible up until, I believe, 6 weeks. And there are those who believe that abortion should be available for any time during the pregnancy, or that the 6-week ban is too limiting. And so there, instead of having to go through the state legislature, they wanted to bring it to the people. And the amendment essentially was very, very capacious. In my reading of it, it was very open, very vague, and essentially just allowed for abortion for essentially any amount of time. There were no particular policy prescriptions in this amendment. It was effectively to open the door for further policies that would be perhaps done in later administrations should they become more pro-choice electors. So it essentially opened the door within the Constitution to have for more permissible abortion rights. And those who were voting no against this amendment said that there's no safeguards for women, there were no parental consent provisions, and there were no sort of limitations beyond that 6 weeks. So that kind of permissivity was unacceptable.
Yeah. I mean, it was a victory, obviously, for pro-life. Do they disclose the percentage of people that voted, or is it only that it was struck down?
They do disclose every tally, every ballot.
Okay.
And it was a very, very narrow victory for pro-life advocates. It was, I believe, 57% of the Florida electorate who voted for this amendment. You might think that would have passed, therefore, but a few decades ago, Florida law requires that all amendments pass a 60% threshold. And so had it been a simple majority, we would have very, very permissible abortion laws in Florida, potentially. But it barely almost passed 3 more percent. So the majority of the Florida electorate apparently allows for at least opening the question again to more permissible abortion rights.
Right. It's tempting because there's so many human dignity issues on the table right now. And I'm from Canada, where there is basically no abortion laws at all. And we're probably 25 years ahead in the gallop towards complete secularization and getting God out and human dignity and all the rest. But we won't go there because I do want to come back to the election that we just observed and watched happen. And I just got a number of questions. Some of them, I'm sure you can answer easily and quickly. Others maybe a little bit longer. But one of the things that I was tracking is there were some commentators suggesting that Kamala Harris was kind of a quote, illegitimate pick, if you will. Now that's scandalous terminology maybe, but it certainly didn't follow the typical process by which somebody is elected as the party leader, the Republican primaries and all the rest of it. So what do you say about that? Was there legitimacy? How did that happen? Like, just clarify what happened there.
Yeah, she had 15 weeks to run a campaign. I can't think of a precedent like that before. It was a highly, highly unusual election. And we've had some pretty unusual elections in U.S. history. The backstory here is that Kamala Harris was not successful in the Democratic primary when she had run in the same primaries as President Joe Biden. And then Biden picked her as his running mate in 2020. They were successful in that. And then when Biden was seeking re-election and then decided to step down abruptly after a really terrible debate performance, there was no primary process in the states in its normal way. I mean, typically primary elections, which is to say, you have your Democratic and your Republican and maybe other parties who have their own sort of internal process to vet and ultimately vote on and nominate one particular candidate and his or her running mate. There's no sort of primary process in the normal way with Harris. So it was basically Biden's endorsement of her and then many other top Democrats who followed along, eventually major figures like Barack Obama, when she became sort of, as it were, crowned, right? It really was just sort of several elites, it seems to me, who pushed opinion toward voting for her as the Democratic nominee. And that's when she received the delegates. I mean, there's a formal process at the Democratic National Convention where you vote. Often, by this point, it's mostly ceremonial. But at this point, it was actually pretty critical that she received those votes to show that she had the party behind her. But it must be said that there were other Democratic politicians who were vying for that spot in critical states who were passed over in favor of Harris. So I think there's a big postmortem kind of analysis going on in the Democratic Party about who's to blame for the loss, and to what extent do we blame people like Harris and Biden, or do we sort of blame other factors? But I think this process, which was highly abbreviated and unusual, certainly had something to do with her, the perception at least, of her being sort of illegitimate, as you put it.
Mm.
I mean, formally speaking, she was the legitimate candidate. I mean, she was duly elected by the delegates at the Democratic National Convention. But I think people who maybe are looking back on this, they may consider this to be, it was too rushed and so too reliant on a few figures who really pushed the opinion toward her.
I mean, clearly there was very little that was normal about this particular election. So
absolutely,
just
part and including the Republican side of things too, right? I mean, so
exactly,
yeah, and it was very unusual.
Yeah, well, it's funny because again, this is a question I didn't prepare you for, but as a Canadian, when you watch all of this unfolding, when we consider a country to our south of 363 million or something like that, and the two candidates that the parties present are these two, you're wondering what is going on. What's happened to politics, just as one that's an outsider, right?
Yeah, it's the word polarized has been used quite often ever since 2016, really. And I think to be fair, it would probably have to span to really understand this. Basically, after Ronald Reagan's election, which was a landslide kind of election, or at least the Bush-Gore election in 2000, when we had just a photo finish kind of analysis of the electoral process, including especially in Florida with, I don't know if you remember the Chads and the hanging Chads and the dippled Chads and these kind of paper ballots, is trying to determine voters' intent by these things, and every vote was sort of scrutinized. So I think it really goes back to sort of the turn of the millennium, when we began to see some very, very, polarized or polarizing sort of electorates and presidential campaigns. And I don't have a hot take on what has gone, wrong here, but it does seem to me that there's an argument to be made about the usefulness of divided government, as some commentators have talked about. Our founders did envisage a government that was not to be unitive and national all the way down. It was meant to have these kind of checks and balances and these kind of, frankly, frictions that ensure that at least at some policies and at some level, that there is a healthy discussion and maybe some, as it were, some putting some brakes on certain policies. That isn't the case necessarily for the military, right? When you have to have that energetic sort of decision making that requires spur of the moment decisions, but maybe in matters of healthcare and education and so on, like we should maybe go a little bit slowly, right? And really consider all these things and maybe have some friction. So I want to leave space for this idea that some amount of polarization or disagreement can be a good thing in a healthy civil society. But the level of polarization that I think we've seen in this past election, and really at least claiming since 2000, is at a level that I think is kind of unhealthy. And, it's easy to blame one party or the other for this. And certainly rhetoric on both sides has been appalling. But I think ultimately it rests on the electorates themselves, right? The voters, the citizens. And here I'll just, mention the really important ideology in the American founding, which is called republicanism. That's small r, republicanism, not a party, but a kind of ideology, a set of ideas. The famous quip of the woman who asked Benjamin Franklin, what did he and his colleagues do? And what did you make, right? And he said, a republic if you can keep it. And, it's a nice little quip because the if you can keep it kind of goes at the heart of Republican idea, which is republics rest on the virtue of the public. It could go away. In other words, monarchy rests on sort of the goodwill and virtue and sort of competence of basically one person, the monarch and his or her advisors, right? And to more or lesser extent, the parliament or legislative equivalent. In America, it really does rest on, and other places that have Republican elements, really does rest on the virtue of the citizenry who make these decisions. And of course, every politician is a citizen. And so, if you're unhappy with the way things are, take a good look at the populace, right? And, your citizenry. If you're unhappy with both the Democrat and Republican ticket, as I know many people are, even though they might have voted for one or the other, take a good hard look at how you're educating children, right? How you are policing, right, as it were, the criminals. Take a good look at what's on television and the internet that people are consuming. That's all going to be sort of, prior and more important, it seems to me, than one presidential election, right? In that sense, electoral politics is downstream from culture.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. A republic, if you can keep it, and the polarization that you referenced earlier. It's funny because I actually had a priest friend who also was observing all of the incivility, if you will, in caught up in the election. And his one comment he said was, well, there are people born of revolution. And he didn't mean that like in a derogatory or even a, profoundly provocative way, but just to understand that there is a fight and there's something good about it. There's something good about robust debate that is necessary, that is true, it's even part of our human nature. We have the capability. Your wife was talking about this when she was on the podcast. Unlike the animals, we can all express ourselves, but we have the actual ability to debate. But it's when you lose the civility of it, when all of a sudden now, when you're speaking with somebody and no matter what they say, you're going to challenge it as something wrong because it's them saying it, that's no longer debate. I remember watching the debate with Reagan. I forget who he was running against, but it was that line when they challenged Reagan for being too old. And he said, yes. I promise I won't use my opponent's inexperience and immaturity against him. And then everybody laughed. There was something like civil about it. There was we're part of something bigger than ourselves here. Anyways, any thoughts on that? There's born of a revolution. There's something good about it.
I think there is something really healthy about civil discourse, not just healthy, but necessary. And I want to emphasize civil here, right? And I think humor, as Reagan often used, can be really helpful there. It kind of takes the edge off. I think that's why people flocked to TV shows like Saturday Night Live, right? Because Saturday Night Live was, sort of the parody of these two candidates and their running mates in ways that I thought was really helpful, right? Because it sort of put a mirror, quite literally when Kamala Harris went on SNL, right? Put a mirror up to these figures to have them see how we perceive them in an exaggerated caricature kind of way. The comedians out there, so long as they're clean, right, provide a really, really helpful sense of irony, right, of distance from the political machinations. So I think humor is really important. I think debate that's logical is really important, avoiding logical fallacies like argumentum ad hominem, right? Just attacking the person, not the message. Sometimes, of course, character matters. Sometimes the person's identity may come into the debate. But to go there first, to malign someone simply because they are an R or a D or a particular race or sex or what religion or whatever it is, I think is sort of besides the point in many of these policy discussions. So that would be a great help. And my wife and I actually co-taught a course on civil discourse at the university. And we're really big believers in creating among our students and whoever else we can influence a set of skills, but also a kind of artful disposition that one should have in discoursing with someone else. We even talked about in our class the importance of food and drink, right, in civil discourse, right? Having someone over for a meal or someone to have a drink with would solve a lot of problems, I think, between people of different viewpoints. It's something that we try to practice, obviously, but I think that famous question, who do you want to have a beer with, is one of the questions that we ask ourselves with regard to politicians. And I think, obviously, it's a sort of silly question in a way, but it points to this idea of, would this person be civil? Would this person have a good conversation with you and really listen to you and sort of be other-directed? Would you have a good time with this person? That's not the kind of question you'd ask for someone who's going to be a commander-in-chief, but it is something that's important for someone who's going to listen to his electorate.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny, the conversation over beer, because again, some of the things I was observing, like to see J.D. Vance go on Theo Vaughn's podcast and have a conversation. I just thought, what am I watching? They're talking about consuming cocaine, and I'm thinking, what has happened? I don't understand this.
Well, present company excluded, but the podcast sort of phenomenon of getting, these candidates to come on their podcast as a kind of free media advertising and to talk with people who maybe otherwise kind of feel like they're disenfranchised or and so on. It was one of the big developments, I think,
Yeah.
in this past election. And I don't think we fully understand what's going on because, especially the mainstream media, right, who have been in some ways sidelined in order to accommodate these podcasters and YouTubers. And I think what's happening there is something that in some ways is sort of designed in the electoral system, which is to discuss different segments of the electorate, young women or young men or sort of working class or whatever it is, however they want to slice it up. So in some sense, it's just that. But there is something a bit worrying, I think, about the amount of influence people who I would sort of consider pretty radical, how much influence they have.
Yeah.
And that just kind of exacerbates the polarization. So you have people are really radical on the right and really radical on the left, and both candidates respectively kind of, went on their podcasts. And obviously they get a different view of that person. Like I actually thought it was a little bit helpful to me to understand a different side of these candidates by watching clips of these podcasts. These podcasters were able to get them to open up about certain topics that I can't imagine an ABC News anchor doing.
Yeah.
But at the same time, they're getting into territory which just seems really radical. I mean, you mentioned cocaine use and so on. I mean, there's something really problematic about normalizing radical discourse. I'm happy to sort of have them part of the discussion in certain ways, but when they have this kind of outsized, sort of disproportionate influence, that's when I worry about normalizing something that really is problematic.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I've got just a few more questions around politics, and then I want to give some time to talk about Catholics in public life specifically, which is kind of your expertise. I'm curious because, again, I'm coming at it from, I've only voted Canadian. I've been a Canadian my entire life, don't have other citizenship. Has the federal election, the presidential election, always had a president and vice president on the ticket? Or is that something that was brought about later on?
So it wasn't always that way. In the first few elections, whoever got the most electoral votes received the presidency, and then whoever got the second most votes received the vice presidency. And the vice presidency was not a particularly well-defined office in the federal government. There are occasions when the vice presidency were vacant for years, the office. So it's come to have a lot more power since the 20th century. But in the first few elections, it was just whoever got first and second place by the Electoral College. And they weren't always on the same side. Adams and Jefferson, most famously in the 1796 election. In the election of 1800, one of the famous elections between Jefferson and Burr, for instance, they tied the Electoral College vote. So the House of Representatives, according to the Constitution, had to break the tie. The Congress then proposed a 12th Amendment and was ratified, which basically specified that electors had to cast separate votes for president and vice president going forward. So that kind of solved this problem of what we found in the election of 1800. So, you could have basically two separate elections, but then effectively by this American Civil War, you began to see running mates where the president sort of began to pick someone they could run with as a potential vice president, as a kind of package deal, in part to garner more votes, right? So if you have someone in the South, maybe get some from the North, trying to span that sectional divide, something like that. So effectively I don't know exactly when this started, but I would say since the 19th century onward, you began to have running mates. And certainly by the 20th century, it was very much the standard thing to do. And it's sort of controlled by the party system now. So when we have primary elections, some states require you to either register as a Republican or a Democrat or independent. And if you're registered as a Democrat, that means that you can vote in the Democratic primary. If you're registered as a Republican, you cannot vote in the Democratic primary as a registered Republican. So in that way, it kind of makes sure that it's sort of an intra-party election. And then the general election is something that you then whether you're registered Republican, Democrat, or whatever, you can vote for whatever party.
I mean, you mentioned that there's been an evolution in the way that the elections are carried out. Is there current issues or challenges or problems within the process at all levels that need to be addressed? Do you think there's holes right now, any gaps in the electoral process? Maybe that's too risky a question.
Well, I don't really know. I mean, I think, let me put it this way, much of the administration of the electoral process, even the federal electoral process, happens at the state and local levels. So there is a federal election commission that sort of superintends over the federal elections in order to make sure that there's free and fair elections. But given our federalist structure, there is a lot of power at the state level to determine the sort of manner and requirements for voting. So you have to be a citizen, but the way in which you register requires different documentation, for instance, to prove that you're a citizen and a resident of the state and so on. There's different, requirements for mail-in balloting. There's different methods for voting beforehand. So, for instance, some states have dedicated mail boxes, right, for ballots. Others require sort of the postmark stamp for a mail-in ballot to be a certain time. The way that the federal government sort of imposes itself is by requiring the same day for the elections, which sort of makes sense to have that synchrony. But a lot of it goes back to the state. So I guess my answer about maybe some kind of reform or change that needs to happen is that there seems to be a problem with this kind of patchwork of laws with regard to identification. So I'm not one to say that there's vast election fraud, but there's got to be at least some election fraud. I mean, there's got to be at least, whether it's actual malintent or just, sort of negligence, right? There's got to be something like that out there. I mean, this is we're talking about, hundreds of thousands of ballots, right, in each state. So I think one way to sort of, that makes sense to me in terms of reform, which is that to have more states require photo ID. So 14 states in Washington, D.C. do not require any documentation to vote at the polls. You need documentation to register to vote, but when you actually show up, they don't require any documentation that you have to furnish. Another 15 states require ID, but accept non-photo IDs as a form of identification. I'm from the state of Wisconsin, and the state of Wisconsin now has one of the strictest photo ID laws. But when I was growing up, I remember my first election, I went to the gymnasium. And that's a great thing about American elections. You just go to these random places.
Yeah.
Sometimes they're just, usually they're schools or something like that. When I saw a vote, I didn't vote in England, but when I saw a vote in England when I was a graduate student, it was in churches, which is kind of surprising to me. But I suppose that happens in America too. But this is the city's gymnasium, and I just walk up and I tell them who I was, and then they asked me my address, and they had remember those dot matrix printing?
Yeah.
They had this big spool of dot matrix printed paper with address. I could have just looked over and read whatever address was there if I was trying to impersonate someone, and she gave me the ballot. It was just shocking to me looking back on how easy it was. I could just impersonate my neighbor. I know my neighbor's address,
Yeah, exactly.
I think having a stricter form of identification would be helpful. I know there's important arguments about access to voting to that. I think you could maybe do like a provisional ballot in that case, and then, later on certify that you actually were there in case you forgot your ID or something like that. But if you're a citizen of the United States, you can't go very much anywhere without or enroll in anything really without some form of identification. I don't see why we can't acquire that for voting. So that would be my reform.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not surprised you would say that because I know that was one of the more controversial type things. Okay, no smooth way of shifting. We're just going to shift and talk about Catholics in public life. So
Sure.
You wrote Our Dear Bought Liberty, 2021, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Well, that's when it was published. Probably wrote it for many months before that. But a lot of people have kind of this understanding, at least, of the prominence of the Protestant faith in the founding of the United States, but don't have as much understanding of Catholics. And so why don't you just give us some of the some of the characters, some of their importance, and their role in your founding.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, when you first think of the American founding, you think of religious members coming to the New World, fleeing from religious persecution. And then they set up an established colony, and then they eventually, their progeny fight in the American Revolution and codify the Constitution. That's sort of the standard story. And my book, Our Dear About Liberty, it basically swaps those typical cast of characters, right? Instead of talking about Protestants, we're talking about Catholics as framers and founders. So it's important for us to look at that story not as a replacement of, Protestants and that story, and certainly others who were deists and maybe sort of levels of commitment that weren't very high. So not as a replacement of that Protestant and deist story, but as an important complement to it. Otherwise, it doesn't really make sense to go from, Catholics are persecuted, Catholics are not allowed to hold public office and so on. And then all of a sudden you have two Catholics in the first federal Congress. We have Catholics who are helping to draft the U.S. Constitution. And you have a Jesuit priest who's allowed to become first Catholic bishop of the United States. If you don't have an understanding of the time between sort of Catholic persecution after Guy Fawkes' plot in 1605 to 1789, then you're going to be sort of scratching your head and saying, how did Catholics perform this remarkable transformation? So the book sets out to sort of answer that question, how Catholics became American, right? How did they join this American experiment? How were they not just tolerated, which was a big advance, but actually given full civil and religious liberty at the federal level and then increasingly at the state levels?
Can you just give some facts of the matter? Like, what did Catholic persecution in the beginning actually look like?
In early America, Catholics were not even allowed in some of these colonies. So, and not that they would necessarily want to be there either, right? Because if you take, for instance, Massachusetts Bay Colony, it was set up as a kind of religious haven for Puritans who were trying to create their own community with their own sort of religious sensibility and set of laws away from the established Church of England, and away from what they saw as sort of papalist elements within that church establishment. So I can imagine any Catholic who'd want to be even a member of that, because even those within that Puritan community would be persecuted if they went out of line. I'm thinking of Anne Hutchinson, who had to be exiled to Rhode Island. First and foremost, they were not necessarily accepted into the early colonies, many of them at least. Within England itself, it really depended on sort of the enforcement of longstanding laws against Catholics. There were longstanding laws, for instance, against priests. If you're found out to be a priest, you would be sort of hunted down. There would actually be bounties on your head. And this is why at some points in post-Reformation England, you see large manor houses where you have holes, and they're called them priest holes, where priests would, usually Jesuits, sort of burrow into these sort of basements or hideaways when the bounters were looking for them. So it can be as extreme as that, right? Active persecution, or it can be the kind of quiet persecution of being ostracized by one's community or having to, in most cases, live your faith underground, so very quietly, maybe without the sacraments for many, many years. Or it could look like sort of conformity was very easy and had a lot of emoluments and benefits, and so you may just publicly conform. Even if you don't fully agree with the established church's doctrines, you might just go to the local parish on Sunday to outwardly conform. So a kind of public Protestant, but the heart of a papist, that sort of idea. And certainly people were accused of doing that. A lot of hypocrisy. People would accuse a lot of people of hypocrisy for this. By the time we get to sort of early America, when we look at the early 17th century, it's surprising, therefore, that you would get a colony like Maryland, and before that, Avalon, which is in modern-day Newfoundland, because that was colonized by a Catholic family, the Calverts, the first and second Lords Baltimore. It's a paradox, right? Catholics weren't allowed to serve in public office unless they swore the oath of allegiance, which Pope says you couldn't do. You couldn't send your children to Catholic schools. You weren't able to sort of fully sort of exercise your faith publicly. But at the same time, the kings allow for these two colonies. So that's the kind of paradox that I'm trying to understand in this book. And it's a pretty shocking discovery.
So how? How did that happen?
So the story of George and Cecil Calvert, the first and second Lord Baltimore, is a really interesting one. George Calvert was raised Catholic, but early in his life conformed to the Protestant establishment. And he was basically forced to. I mean, the local officials required him to get rid of all his papist books, and they only could have a Protestant version of the Bible, and so on and so forth. But that public conformity allowed him to eventually go to Oxford, Trinity College, Oxford, and rise in the ranks of public service, eventually getting to the first Secretary of State for King James I, which is effectively the most prominent civil servant job you can obtain. Around the time in which he's at the height of his career, he reverts back to his childhood faith of Catholicism. And what's extraordinary is that the king doesn't imprison him or anything like that, or worse. In fact, he gives him some land in Canada in order to colonize. He had shown his loyalty throughout his whole career, so it wasn't as if the king thought, because he's Catholic now, he's going to undermine me. But at the same time, this was a way to, maybe push him out, to pasture, as it were, and go do something else effectively, preferably across the ocean, and maybe bring some Catholics with you so they can have a kind of tacit toleration. And so that's what he did. He brought Protestants and Catholics with him. And it was a terrible, terrible winter. A lot of people died. So it was an unsuccessful colony in that respect. But he had Protestants have their services in his own home, much to the ire of Catholics. But much to the ire of Protestants, he allowed Catholics to worship freely as well. So it's kind of this early moment of toleration in North America. And then George Calvert went to Virginia to seek warmer climate. But there he had to sign this oath of allegiance, which no Catholic could sign in good conscience, the Pope said. And so he went back to London with a kind of revised oath, actually, something that you just basically say, look, I'm going to swear my loyalty to you, but I'm not going to talk about papal authority or anything that's controversial. And with that, the next king allowed another colony called Maryland, and that was given to his son as a kind of inheritance because George Calvert died a few weeks before the charter was signed.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah, so effectively what's going on here is the kings are granting this kind of benefit to a Catholic family because they know they're loyal. These kings are relatively pragmatic in the beginning. And so as long as they're loyal and they're going to colonize for England, they're willing to take that chance. I mean, this is a risky endeavor, right? I mean, this is financially, physically risky with no great chance of success. So they're willing to take a bet on these Catholics, and they're willing to give them what they desire, which is religious toleration. And so Cecil Calvert, the son, takes over in Maryland, and he's famous for promulgating this Maryland Toleration Act, which grants all Trinitarian Christians toleration. And it's one of the first toleration laws in North America, and it comes from the hand of a Catholic.
Do you think that there was ever a time where Catholics in the United States thought that achieving the highest office, as President Kennedy did in 1961, was an impossibility?
I think for the most of, sort of American history up until the early 20th century, it was considered to be a near impossibility.
Wow.
And I think part of that has to do in the beginning with the fact that Catholics were 1% of the population around the American founding. The population of Catholics increases substantially with the great waves of migration coming from Europe and from Latin America, especially German and Irish and Italians, and some French after the French Revolution. So there's a great wave of immigrant Catholics, which creates all sorts of issues for Catholics because there's just anti-Catholic sentiment. There's a revival of anti-Catholic sentiment as well that we had seen in the 17th century. And so really things don't calm down until the early 20th century. But even when Al Smith, who was the governor of New York, a Catholic who made a bid for the presidency, even then, he had a very famous exchange in the Atlantic Monthly magazine on his Catholicism, an exchange with a Protestant who was sort of criticizing him for his Catholic faith as being incompatible with American ideals and institutions. So even in the early 20th century, when Al Smith ran, you get a pretty substantial anti-Catholic sentiment. I'm not saying that's the reason why he lost, but it was certainly there. And so when we get to someone like Kennedy, he still has to overcome sort of lingering anti-Catholic sentiment. But it's around the time of, the church becoming, Vatican II, becoming more sort of engaged with the modern world, more intentional about that. It's a time when Kennedy can sort of reinvent the public face of Catholicism, not always as a good thing, by the way, given Kennedy's personal life.
Yeah.
But also, effectively his famous speech put an end to the so-called Catholic question for him. That was in 1960 in the Greater Houston Ministerial Association, where he gets in. It's very remarkable, very courageous of him to get in front of a group of Protestant ministers and Protestant followers and explain why he, as a Catholic, would not undermine America and the Constitution and would be faithful to his oaths and so on. In the course of that speech, he, I think, argues too strongly in favor of a strict separation of church and state. He basically says, look, the church doesn't speak for me, and I don't speak for the church. I'm going to govern the way I think. Like, Catholicism has effectively no say in that, which maybe that was true for John F. Kennedy, but I think any faithful Catholic would say that, of course, the Catholic Church informs their conscience.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't amount to a pope getting a phone call from the pope and Pope telling, you got to veto this thing, and then he does it. It's not like a puppeteer. But I think it was sort of, again, too strongly argued to say a strict separation of church and state, which has never been the Catholic teaching. There's a juridical separation. The church and state have different spheres and powers and so on, but certainly can cooperate in certain issues. So I think it was too strong, but it certainly worked rhetorically. And ever since then, very few Catholics have been looked askance in the public for being Catholic. And in fact, a lot of the sort of debate about Catholicism now is within the Catholic Church about whether certain Catholics in public life are not living out their faith as much as they should.
Yeah, no, for sure. So here's a big question then. Should Catholics aspire for public office?
I think absolutely. I think any person of goodwill, Catholic or not, should aspire for public office. Any person of goodwill who has the common good in mind. And I don't think, fear of anti-Catholic sentiment should be a barrier to any Catholic thinking about running for office, at the local to federal level. We have a Catholic majority on the Supreme Court, 6 Catholic justices. We have, currently a Catholic president. We'll have a Catholic vice president in January. We'll have lots of, hundreds of Catholics in Congress and, governors and so on. So I think Catholics are very well represented, I think, overall in the public life. I think where someone thinking about running for office have some pause is whether they would be able to faithfully execute, the laws that conflict with their faith. That's when, and that goes for execution of laws or making laws or deciding cases about the law, in the justice system. So, we have a lot of precedents there. Antonin Scalia, for instance, the late justice of the Supreme Court, was unapologetically Catholic. He was very open about that. And yet he ruled on some decisions that I think many of his Catholic friends would not have agreed on, Maybe were against sort of Catholic social teaching as they understood it. But his argument was always, I'm a textualist, I look at the text, I look what the lawmakers have given me, and I try to divine what they meant by that, and I decide based on that. And so he was emphatic about not being a policy maker as he understood it. So that's one way to understand one's job as a justice. I think as a lawmaker, you have to vote your conscience, but of course you also have to keep in mind your people that you're representing. So I think it's a really, really hard job. And if you find that your conscience is very, very sensitive, I think you would really want to discern with the guidance of good counsel, sort of how you'd operate in those situations. I think there's especially if, when you get to high office, like presidency, vice presidency, there are just some issues that you may feel very, very compromised about. I think that would require a lot of prayer and discernment.
Absolutely. I mean, when we watch some of the Supreme Court appointments that you had and the process by which they were appointed in the interrogation, it doesn't make it very pleasing to consider that. That's for sure.
The so-called dog whistle, right, of the dogma lives loudly within you. I think immediately was understood as sort of somehow anti-Catholic. I don't know, the person who said that and what, her intent was, but there is something about long-standing, anti-Catholic prejudice that we see in films, we see in sort of novels, and sort of just popular discourse that sort of filters its way in ways that we don't understand, right? I mean, we in American football, we say the Hail Mary. Like most people don't understand what what that means, right? It's just part of our parlance, And so I think part of this just has to do with the more Catholics are open about their faith and engaging in public discourse, the more these kind of conversations and sort of the meaning of these words and the meaning behind certain Catholic social teachings will be at least people won't be scratching their heads and thinking, why do Catholics believe this?
Right.
They'll at least have reasons for it. They can still disagree with it. But the more Catholics are in the arena, as it were, I think the better for that.
Absolutely. Of course, the wonderful line in the wisdom and the courageous witness of Thomas More when he said, "I die the king's good servant, but God's first," is a real something to aspire to if we're serving that office. Not that we're serving kings anymore, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. The thrust of that is, the spirit of it is God and country, right?
Absolutely.
In fact, the quotation that's been passed on to me, I am the king's good servant and I'm God's servant, right? First. Yeah. And. It's not but and. And there shouldn't be any compatibility. And the tragedy of More's life, right, is that there was a conflict when there really shouldn't have been.
Exactly. That's a whole nother topic.
Yes.
A big one at that. You mentioned Antonin Scalia. We just had Father Paul Scalia.
Yes, I saw, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was celebrating the Red Mass and different speaking events. So, Michael, why don't you just tell us where people can find you online and where they can get your book?
I have a website, michaelbreidenbach.com. I won't, spell every letter of my last name, but you can see it on the podcast or YouTube title, michaelbreidenbach.com. And that's where you can see the books I've written. Our Do About Liberty is about Catholics in early America. It's available on Amazon. And I've also edited a volume on the First Amendment in the United States with regard to religion. My wife and I have some popular pieces as well for general audiences on faith and public life and history and philosophy. So do check it out.
Do check it out. Listeners, I hope that you enjoyed this episode. Michael, thank you so much for doing this, not just the podcast, but all that you're doing, forming the next generation. It's just such important work, and I appreciate it. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. And thanks for all the work you're doing. I really, really benefit from it as well. So thanks for having me on.
You bet. Thanks, everyone. See you next episode.